Like many of Nintendo's other consoles, the Nintendo 64 was home to a wide variety of rather weird peripherals that attempted to make the Nintendo gameplay experience more fun and interesting for the user. And one of the more well-known of these peripherals was the Nintendo 64 Transfer Pak that essentially functioned as a bridge between your N64 and Game Boy games. The specifics of what the Transfer Pak allowed you to do were dependent on the game you were playing, and ranged in scope from small things like unlocking cheats and special courses, to large things like playing specific Game Boy games on your TV. But, true to its name, the main selling point of the Nintendo 64 Transfer Pak was of course the ability to transfer data between your Nintendo 64 games and your Game Boy games. Undoubtedly the biggest example of this was the N64 Transfer Pak's use throughout the Pokemon Stadium series of games. Players could import Pokemon from their Game Boy games and use them to battle as well as trade with other players. Pokemon Stadium was a fun game on its own, but it would be a lie to say that it wasn't heavily reliant on the Transfer Pak for longevity. The game even came bundled with one, just so everyone that bought the game would have at least a single Transfer Pak to use. This bundle with Pokemon Stadium was actually the initial release for the Transfer Pak in many regions. You can't use the Transfer Pak without a compatible game, so this actually makes a good deal of sense. The first ever release of the N64 Transfer Pak was on August 1st, 1998 in Japan, where it released alongside the original Pokemon Stadium, which never came to the West. The peripheral actually has a different name over in Japan, being known as the 64GB Pak. The 64 represents the N64, and the GB represents the Game Boy, but if you were to look at this name without any context, you'd probably assume it was some sort of 64GB memory pack or something. This is possibly why the name was changed over here in the West when it released nearly 2 years later in the year 2000. This was an exceedingly late release in terms of the N64's life cycle, seeing as the GameCube was set to come out the following year. However, that didn't stop Pokemon Stadium from selling over 5 million copies and becoming the 6th best-selling N64 game of all time. I'm not 100% sure every one of these games came with a Transfer Pak, but suffice it to say, there were a ton of them sold and in use around the world. But even though the Transfer Pak was a huge hit, the impending release of the GameCube definitely had an effect on its lifespan. In the West, we only ever saw 6 games that were compatible with the Transfer Pak, 2 of which had extremely minimal use of the peripheral. In Japan, however, the 64GB Pak saw use on a total of 17 games. Still not too much, but that's almost 3 times what we had over here. So like many other weird peripherals Nintendo would put out back in the day, the N64 Transfer Pak was very much a Japan-centric device. But I think that's enough backstory. Now let's talk about who was responsible for the development of the Nintendo 64 Transfer Pak. Of the 3 peripherals that I've taken a look at so far in this series, the Transfer Pak is by far the most successful in terms of sales, supported games, and even longevity. But contrary to what you might think based on this popularity, there is very little information available about its development. So much so that I was really considering whether or not I'd be able to include this section in the video. I mean, there's not even a dedicated Wikipedia page for the Transfer Pak. It's only mentioned in a list of all the N64 accessories that only gives each peripheral about a page of information. And all other fan sites, interviews, and articles about the Transfer Pak pretty much just list out the same stuff the Wikipedia entry says. I was really at a loss for what to do. But then after a few days of mulling the issue over in my head, I thought, the Transfer Pak came packaged with Pokemon Stadium and was very deeply connected to that series, so maybe there's something I can find out about it in the game. And lo and behold, after looking through the credits of the game, I was able to find a section called Transfer Pak Staff. This was a short list of only 5 names of people that were involved with the Transfer Pak in some capacity. Those people are Koshima Kazuo, Kimijima Yuji, Mitsunori Koji, Koshishi Kazunori, and Ashida Kenichiro. I have no way of confirming that these people were involved in the development of the N64 Transfer Pak. For all we know, they could have just helped with Pokemon Stadium's specific implementation of the device, but there is some evidence that might point to a deeper connection between these 5 names and the hardware side of things. That is that the 2 men who actually have some sort of widely available record of their work with Nintendo are associated heavily with hardware development. Those 2 men are Koshishi Kazunori and Ashida Kenichiro. Koshishi is best known for being the project lead on the 3DS XL, but he also did work on hardware for WarioWare Twisted, as well as the DSi camera. According to a few different Iwata Asks interviews pertaining to the 3DS, Koshishi is a member of the mechanical design team at Nintendo. In his own words, mechanical design is optimally arranging and packing in all the many parts within the system. We design in cooperation with the team designing the exterior. Definitely a skill that would have been necessary to the development of the N64 Transfer Pak. So as far as Koshishi goes, based on his future endeavors, there is a very strong likelihood he helped in hardware development on the Transfer Pak. But what about Ashida? Well, he as well has a long history at Nintendo, and has worked on hardware for most, if not all of it. His largest project that I know of was the designing of the Wii console and the Wii remote. He's been developing hardware with Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division for some time now, the first device he worked on being the SNES controller. All this information comes from the Iwata Asks interview pertaining to the Wii Remote, where Ashida was one of the interviewees. Sadly, there was no talk about the N64 Transfer Pak in any of the Iwata Asks interviews, so once again I can't confirm to what degree these two, let alone the other three, were involved in its development, but I think it's safe to assume at this point that they were at least on the hardware side of things. If you've watched the other videos in this series, you probably know what's coming next, and that is of course the part where we talk about the exterior design, as well as the internals of this peripheral. Let's start with the outside. The first thing that will probably stick out to you, no pun intended, is a large protrusion on the top of the device that houses the pins that connect to the N64 controller's expansion port located on the bottom of the controller. Also on this protrusion is a rectangular indent that locks the Transfer Pak into the controller. This is something found on all Nintendo 64 controller peripherals like the Rumble Pack and the Controller Pack. Makes sense because it would be kind of annoying if your peripherals kept falling out all the time. But ironically, the Transfer Pak was notorious for getting disconnected after even the slightest shock to the controller. Obviously it didn't physically fall out of the controller, but it did lose connection to the console quite often. Another very striking feature of the Transfer Pak is the large curve on the back that is not only very visually pleasing, but also makes removing the Transfer Pak somewhat easier. The last and probably most important feature of the Transfer Pak is of course the big see-through slot on the bottom of the peripheral labeled Game Boy. See-through plastic was all the rage back in the 90s when the 64GB pack first released in Japan, so it makes sense that we'd see it here as well. In order to get a better look at the internals though, we're going to have to remove a total of 4 screws from the underside of the device. And as you might have guessed based on the fact that this is a first-party Nintendo peripheral, it's not going to be as simple as just pulling out a Phillips head. The screws we're dealing with this time are tri-wing or tri-point screws. The terms are used interchangeably a lot of the time for this type of screw, but if you want to get technical, they should actually be considered tri-point screws. Tri-wing screws have a more unique shape to them compared to the simple Y shape of a tri-point screw. But honestly, just call them whatever you want. This was one of the earliest instances of tri-point screws being used by Nintendo, the earliest I know of being the N64 controller itself. I was honestly a little surprised to see them here because I typically associate tri-point screws with Nintendo's later consoles, but here we are. Once we get these 4 screws out and lift off the bottom of the Transfer Pak, we are greeted with a relatively large board for this kind of peripheral that has a few key things I'd like to take a look at. Number 1, of course, is the large centralized chip labeled LESH-NUS. Based on the previous videos in this series, you might have been expecting to see the same chip that can be found on, say, the N64 controller or the Game Boy, but as far as I know, this is a chip that was specifically designed for use in the Transfer Pak. I guess it makes sense, seeing as this peripheral doesn't really function like either of those devices, but still a rather interesting thing to note. On the other hand, the Game Boy cartridge pin connector is, as you'd expect, almost identical to what you'd find on a normal Game Boy. However, there is one key difference. No, I'm not talking about the bright yellow color, although that is a cool feature. I'm talking about the tiny plastic lever found on the inside bottom of the connector. Now, I can't be 100% sure as to what this lever does, but I can at least venture a guess. I think it was used as an easy way to tell when a Game Boy game was inserted into the Transfer Pak. On a Game Boy, it's pretty easy to tell when a game is or isn't inserted because if it's not, it won't be running, but on a peripheral like this, the game will continue to run even if there's no game inserted into the Transfer Pak. So the lever was put into place as a simple check to see if a game is inserted during gameplay. I have no way to confirm this theory, but I think it's a pretty plausible one. And last but not least, if we lift the board up and out of the shell, we can see that there is a rather large ribbon cable that's been used to connect the main board of the Transfer Pak to the pins that will eventually come into contact with the controller's expansion port. The actual pins themselves are held to the top of the device with a single Phillips head screw. One thing you'll see a lot on Nintendo consoles, controllers, and peripherals is that even though they use these really obscure screws like tri-point and gambit on the outside of the device, typically they just use Phillips head screws on the inside. Basically all they care about is keeping you out of their products, and once you actually get inside they just give up on uniformity and use Phillips because they know just as well as we do that they are much easier to work with for many people. Once we unscrew this Phillips screw, we can get a closer look at what the end of the ribbon cable looks like. It's not really anything special, but I thought I'd show you guys anyway, just in case there was anyone out there that was curious about it. And I think that pretty much wraps up the internals. The Nintendo 64 Transfer Pak was a device that saw almost unheard of levels of success for a peripheral. This was no doubt thanks in large part to the very popular Pokemon Stadium series that relied heavily on and came bundled with it. But the Transfer Pak did not rely solely on the Pokemon name for its success. It was a very unique and straight-up ingenious device that made the dream of seeing our favorite Pokemon battle in realistic 3D on our TVs that was held by many kids of the time a reality. However, much like many of the other peripherals Nintendo has put out over the years, I do feel like it was very underutilized, especially in the West. There's so many interesting possibilities with this kind of technology that I feel Nintendo didn't even scratch the surface of on the Nintendo 64. Luckily, the Transfer Pak would see a kind of spiritual successor in the form of the Game Boy Advance link cable for the GameCube. This device had much more support than the Transfer Pak, with nearly 60 games supporting at least some form of use. But I think that's a topic for another video. So, what did you guys think of the third installment in the Weird Peripherals series? I know it might have been a little shorter than the previous entries, but I think that just comes down to the amount of information available and the complexity of the device. If you have any peripheral in particular you'd like me to cover next, go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I'll see what I can do. As always, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video, it really means a lot to me. If you enjoyed today's video, consider giving it a like, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. Who's that Pokemon? It's Ackerman. Ackerman.